Helen McCrane here again with two tales for St. Paddy's Day. Stories as sweet and gentle as a soft spring rain upon the fields of Tipperary. The Ring and the Poteen Maker. And for those of you who don't know exactly what poteen is, well, let's just say I think you'll figure it out for yourselves before too long. I should like you to have known my grandmother. She was my mother's mother, and as I remember her, she was a widow with a warm farm in Kickham County in Tipperary. Her land was on the southern slope of a hill, and there it drank in the sun, which, to me, always seemed to be balanced on the teeth of the Galtees. Each year I spent the greater part of my summer holidays at my grandmother's place. It was a great change for me to leave our home in a bitter sea-coast village in Kerry and visit my grandmother's. Why, man, the grass gone to waste on 100 yards of the roadside in Tipperary was as much as you'd find in a dozen of our sea-poison fields. I always thought it a pity to see all that fine grass go to waste by the verge of the road. I think so still. Although my Uncle Con was married, my grandmother held the whip hand in the farm. At the particular time I'm trying to recall, the first child was in the cradle. Oh, how time has galloped away. That child is now a nun in a convent in the Seychelles Islands. My Uncle Con's wife, my Aunt Annie, was a gentle, delicate girl who was only charmed in herself to have someone to assume the responsibilities of the place, which was just as well indeed, considering the nature of woman my grandmother was. Since that time when her husband's horse had walked into the farmyard unguarded, with my grandfather, Martin Dermody, dead in the body of the car. Her heart had turned to stone in her breast. Small wonder that turning, since she was left with 6 young children, 5 girls and 1 boy, my Uncle Con. But she faced the world bravely and did well by them all. But she was hard, main hard. Once at a race meeting I picked up a jockey's crop, and when I balanced it on my palm, it reminded me of my grandmother. Once I had a 22-pound salmon laced to 16 feet of Castleconnell greenheart. The rod reminded me of my grandmother. True, like the rod and crop, she had an element of flexibility, but like them, there was no trace of fragility. Now, after all these years, I cannot recall her person clearly. To me, she's but something tall and dark and austere. But lately, I see her character with a greater clarity. Now I understand things that puzzled me when I was a boy. Towards me, she displayed a certain black affection. Oh, but I made her laugh warmly once. That was when I told her of the man who had stopped me on the road beyond the lime kiln and asked me if I were the grandson of Martin Dermody. Inflating with a shy pride, I told him that I was. And he gave me a shilling and said, "Maybe you're called Martin after your grandfather?" "No," I said, "I'm called Con after my Uncle Con." It was then my grandmother had laughed, a little warmly. But my Uncle Con caught me under the armpits and tousled my hair and said I was a clever Kerry rascal. The solitary occasion on which I remember her to have shown emotion was remarkable. Maybe remarkable isn't the proper word. Obscene would be closer to the mark. Obscene, I would have thought of it then, had I known the meaning of the word. Today, I think it merely pathetic. How was it that it all started? Yes, there I was, with my bare legs trailing from the heel of a loaded hay float. I was watching the broad silver parallels we were leaving in the clean after grass. My Uncle Con was standing in the front of the float, guiding the mare. Drawn in the hay to the hay shed we were. Already we had a pillar and a half of the hay shed filled. My grandmother was up on the hay, forking the lighter trusses. The servant boy was handling the heavier forkfuls, and a neighbour was throwing it up to them. When the float stopped at the hay shed, I noticed that something was amiss. For one thing, the man on the hay was idle, as indeed was the man on the ground. And my grandmother was on the ground, looking at the hay with cold, calculating eyes. She turned to my Uncle Con. "Drawing no more hay, Con," she said. "I've lost my wedding ring." "Where? In the hay?" he queried. "Yes, in the hay." "But I thought you had a caper." "Well, I've lost a caper too. My hands are getting thin." "Ah, the story could be worse," he commented. My grandmother did not reply for a little while. She was eyeing the stack with enmity. "'Tis in that half pillar," she said at last. "I must look for it." "You've a job before you, mother," said Uncle Con. She spoke to the servant boy and the neighbour. "Go down and shake out those couple of pikes at the end of the bog meadow," she ordered. "They're heating in the centre." "Can't we be drawn into the idle pillar, mother?" my Uncle Con asked gently. "No, Con," she answered. "I'll be putting the hay from the middle pillar there." The drawing in was over for the day. That was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Before she tackled the half pillar, my grandmother went down on her hands and knees and started to search the loose hay in the idle pillar. She searched wisp by wisp, even sop by sop. My Uncle Con beckoned to me to come away. Anyway, we knew she'd stop at 6 o'clock. 6 to 6 was her motto for working hours. She never broke that rule. That was a Monday evening. On Tuesday we offered to help, my Uncle Con and I. She was down on her knees when we asked her. No, she said abruptly. Then, by way of explanation, when she saw that we were crestfallen, "You see, if we didn't find it, I'd be worried that you didn't search as carefully as you should, and I'd have no peace of mind until I had searched it all over again." So she worked hard all day, breaking off only for her meals and stopping sharp at 6 o'clock. By Wednesday evening she'd made a fair gap in the hay, but had found no ring. Now and again during the day we used to go down to see if she had had any success. She was very wan in the face when she stopped in the evening. On Thursday morning, her face was still more strained and drawn. She seemed reluctant to leave the rick, even to take her meals. What little she ate seemed like so much dust in her mouth. We took down tea to her several times during the day. By Friday, the house was on edge. My Uncle Con spoke guardedly to her at dinner time. "This will set us back a great deal, Mother," he said. I know, son. I know, son. I know," was all she said in reply. Saturday came and the strain was unendurable. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she found the caper. We had been watching her in turns from the kitchen window, and I remember my uncle's face lighting up and saying, "Glory, she's found it." But he drew a long breath when again she started burrowing feverishly in the hay. And we knew it was only the caper. We didn't run out at all. We waited till she came in at 6 o'clock. There were times between 3 and 6 when our three heads were together at a small window watching her. I was thinking she was like a mouse nibbling at a giant's loaf. At 6 o'clock she came in and said, "I found the caper." After her tea, she couldn't sit still. She fidgeted around the kitchen for an hour or two, and then "Laws were made to be broken," said my grandmother with a brittle bravery, and she stalked out to the hay shed. Again we watched her. Coming on for dusk, she returned and lighted a stable lantern and went back to resume her search. Nobody crossed her. We didn't say yes, aye, or no to her. After a time, my Uncle Con took her heavy coat off the rack and went down and threw it across her shoulders. I was with him. "There's a touch of frost there tonight, Mother," said my Uncle Con. We loitered for a while in the darkness outside the ring of her lantern's light. But she resented our pitying eyes, so we went in. We sat around the big fire, waiting, Uncle Con, Aunt Annie, and I. And it was the lonely waiting, without speaking, just as if we were waiting for an old person to die, or for a child to come into the world. Near 12, we heard her step on the cobbles. 'Twas typical of my grandmother that she placed the lantern on the ledge of the dresser and quenched the candle in it before she spoke to us. "I found it," she said. The words dropped out of her drawn face. "Get hot milk for my mother, Annie," said Uncle Con briskly. My grandmother sat by the fire a little to one side. Her face was as cold as death. I kept watching her like a hawk, but her eyes didn't even flicker. The wedding ring was inside its keeper, and my grandmother kept twirling it round and round with the fingers of her right hand. And suddenly, as if ashamed of her fingers' betrayal, she hid her hands under her apron. Then, unpredictably, the fists under the apron came up to meet her face, and her face went down to meet the fists in the apron. "Oh, Martin, Martin," she sobbed. And then she cried like the rain. When he taught me some years ago, he was an old man near his retirement, and when he would pass through the streets of the little town on his way from school, you could hear the women talking about him as they stood in their doors knitting or nursing their babies. "Poor man, he's done, killing himself, digging his own grave." With my bag of books under my arm, I could hear them, but I could never understand why they said he was digging his own grave. And when I would ask my mother, she would scold me. "Take your dinner like a good boy and don't be listening to the hard backbiters of this town. Your father has always a good word for Master Craig, so that should be enough for you." "But why do they say he's killing himself?" "Why do who say? Didn't I tell you to take your dinner and not be repeating what the idle gossips of this town are saying? Listen to me, son. Master Craig is a decent, good-living man, a kindly man that would go out of his way to do you a good turn. If Master Craig was in any other town, he'd have got a place in the new school at the square, instead of being stuck forever in that wee poky bit of a school at the edge of the town." It was true, the school was small. A two-room ramshackle of a place that lay at the edge of the town beyond the last street lamp. We all loved it. Around it grew a few trees, their trunks hacked with boys' names and pierced with nibs and rusty drawing pins. In summer, when the windows were open, we could hear the leaves rubbing together, and in winter see the raindrops hanging on the bare twigs. It was a draughty place, and the master was always complaining of the cold, and even in the early autumn he would wear his overcoat in the classroom and rub his hands together. "Boys, it's very cold today. Do you feel the cold?" And to please him we would answer, "Yes, sir, 'tis very cold." He would continue to rub his hands, and he would look out at the old trees cast in their leaves, or at the broken spout that flung its tail of rain against the window. He always kept his hands clean, and 3 times a day he would wash them in a basin and wipe them on a roller towel affixed to the inside of his press. He had a hanger for his coat and a brush to brush away the chalk that accumulated on the collar in the course of the day. In the wet, windy month of November, 3 buckets were placed on the top of the desks to catch the drips that plopped here and there from the ceiling. And those drops made different music according to the direction of the wind. And when the buckets were filled, the master always called me to empty them, and I would take them one at a time and swirl them into the drain at the street, and stand for a minute, gazing down at the wet roofs of the town, or listening to the rain pecking at the lunch papers scattered about on the cinders. "What's it like outside?" he always asked when I came in with the empty buckets. "Sir, 'tis very bad." He would write sums on the board and tell me to keep an eye on the class, and out to the porch he would go and stand in grim silence, watching the rain nibbling at the puddles. Sometimes he would come in and I would see him sneak his hat from the press and disappear for 5 or 10 minutes. we would fight with rollers or paper darts till our noise would disturb the mistress next door, and in she would come and stand with her lips compressed, her fingers in her book. There was silence as she upbraided us. "Mean, low, good-for-nothing Kerner boys. Wait till Master Craig comes back, and I'll let him know what angels he has, and I'll give him special news about you." And she shakes her book at me. "An altar boy on Sunday, and a corner boy for the rest of the week." We would let her barge away, the buckets plink-plonking as they filled up with rain, and her own class beginning to hum now that she was away from them. When Mr. Craig came back, he would look at us and ask if we had disturbed Miss Lagan. Our silence or our tossed hair always gave him the answer. He would correct the sums on the board and flivel the pages of the book with his thumb and listen to us reading. And occasionally he would glance out of the side window at the river that flowed through the town, and above it the bedraggled row of houses whose tumbling yard walls shared to the river's edge. "The loveliest county in Ireland is County Down," he used to say, with a sweep of his arm to the river and the tin cans and the chalked walls of the houses. During that December he was ill for 2 weeks, and when he came back amongst us he was greatly failed. To keep out the draughts he nailed perforated plywood over the ventilators and stuffed blotting paper between the wide crevices at the jambs of the door. There were muddy marks of a ball on one of the windows, and on one pane a long crack with fangs at the end of it. "So someone has drawn the river Ganges while I was away," he said. And whenever he came to the geography of India, he would refer to the Ganges Delta by pointing to the cracks on the pane. When our ration of coal for the fire was used up, he would send me into the town with a bucket, a coat over my head to keep off the rain, and the money in my fist to buy a stone of coal. He always gave me a penny to buy sweets for myself, and I can always remember that he kept his money in a waistcoat pocket. Back again I would come with the coal, and he would give me disused exercise books to light the fire. "Chief Stoker," he called me, and the name has stuck to me to this day. It was at this time that the first snow had fallen, and someone, by using empty potato bags, had climbed over the glass-topped wall and stolen the school coal. And for some reason, Mr. Craig did not send me with the bucket to buy more. The floor was continually wet from our boots, and our breath frosted the windows. Whenever the door opened, a cold draught would rush in and gulp down the breath-warmed air in the room. We would jig our feet and sit on our hands to warm them. Every half hour, Mr. Craig would make us stand, and while he lilted O'Donnell Aboo, we did a series of physical exercises which he had taught us. And in the excitement and the exultation, we forgot about our sponging boots and the snow that pelted against the windows. It was then that he did his lessons in science, and we were delighted to see the Bunsen burner attached to the gas bracket which hung like an inverted T from the middle of the ceiling. The snoring Bunsen seemed to heat up the room, and we all gathered round it, pressing in on top of it, till he scattered us back to our places with a cane. "Sit down," he would shout. "There's no need to stand. Everybody will be able to see." The cold spell remained, and over again he repeated one lesson in science, which he called evaporation and condensation. "I'll show you how to purify the dirtiest of water," he had told us. "Even the filthiest water from the old river could be made fit for drinking purposes." In a glass trough he had a dark brown liquid, and when I got his back turned, I dipped my finger in it, and it tasted like treacle or burnt candy. And then I remembered about the packets of brown sugar and tins of treacle I had seen in his press. He placed some of the brown liquid in a glass retort and held it aloft to the class. "In this retort I have water which I have discoloured and made impure. In a few minutes I'll produce from it the clearest of spring water." And his weary eyes twinkled, and although we could see nothing funny in that, we smiled because he smiled. The glass retort was set up with a flaming Bunsen underneath, and as the liquid was boiling, the steam was trapped in a long-necked flask on which I sponged cold water. With our eyes we followed the bubbling mixture and the steam turning into drops and dripping rapidly into the flask. The air was filled with a biscuity smell, and the only sound was the snore of the Bunsen. Outside was the cold air and the falling snow. Presently the master turned out the gas and held up the flask containing the clear water. "As pure as crystal," he said, and we watched him pour some of it into a tumbler, hold it in his delicate fingers, and put it to his lips. With wonder we watched him drink it, and then our eyes travelled to the dirty, cakey scum that had congealed on the glass sides of the retort. He pointed at this with his ruler. "The impurities are sifted out, and the purest of pure water remains." And for some reason he gave his roguish smile. He filled up the retort again with the dirty brown liquid and repeated the experiment until he had a large bottle filled with the purest of pure water. The following day it was still snowing and very cold. The master filled up the retort with the clear liquid which he had stored in the bottle. "I'll boil this again to show you that there are no impurities left." So once again we watched the water bubbling, turning to steam and then to shining drops. Mr. Craig filled his tumbler. "As pure as crystal," he said. And then the door opened, and in walked the inspector. He was muffled to the ears, and snow covered his hat and his attaché case. We all stared at him. He was the old, kind man we had seen before. He glanced at the bare fire grate and at the closed windows with their sashes edged with snow. Water continued to bubble in the retort, giving out its pleasant smell. The inspector shook hands with Mr. Craig, and they talked and smiled together. The inspector now and again looking towards the empty grate and shaking his head. He unrolled his scarf and flicked the snow from off his shoulders and from his attaché case. He sniffed the air, rubbed his frozen hands together, and took a black notebook from his case. The snow pluffed against the windows. The wind hummed under the door. "Now, boys," Mr. Craig continued, holding up the tumbler of water from which a thread of steam wriggled in the air. He talked to us in a strange voice, and told us about the experiment as if we were seeing it for the first time. Then the inspector took the warm tumbler and questioned us about our lesson. "It should be perfectly pure water," he said. And he sipped at it. He tasted its flavour. He sipped at it again. He turned to Mr. Craig. They whispered together, the inspector looking towards the retort, which was still bubbling and sending out its twirl of steam to be condensed to water of purest crystal. He laughed loudly, and we smiled when he again put the tumbler to his lips, and this time drank it all. Then he asked us more questions and told us how, if we were shipwrecked, we could make pure water from salt sea water. Mr. Craig turned off the Bunsen, and the inspector spoke to him. The master filled up the inspector's tumbler and poured out some for himself in a cup. And then the inspector made jokes with us and listened to us singing and told us we were the best class in Ireland. Then he gave us a few sums to do in our books. He put his hands in his pockets and jingled his money, rubbed a little peephole in the breath-covered window, and peered out at the loveliest sight in Ireland. He spoke to Mr. Craig again, and Mr. Craig shook hands with him, and they both laughed. The inspector looked at his watch. Our class was let out early, and while I remained behind to tidy up the science apparatus, the master gave me an empty treacle tin to throw in the bin, and told me to carry the inspector's case up to the station. I remember that day well as I walked behind them through the snow, carrying the attaché case, and how loudly they talked and laughed as the snow whirled cold from the river. I remember how they crouched together to light their cigarettes, how match after match was thrown on the road, and how they walked off with the unlighted cigarettes still in their mouths. At the station, Mr. Craig took a penny from his waistcoat pocket, and as he handed it to me, it dropped on the snow. I lifted it And he told me I was the best boy in Ireland. When I was coming from his funeral last week, God have mercy on him, I recalled that wintry day and the feel of the cold penny, and how much more I know now about Mr. Craig than I did then. On my way out of the town, I don't live there now, I passed the school and saw a patch of new slates on the roof and an ugly iron barrier near the door to keep the home-going children from rushing headlong onto the road. I knew if I had looked at the trees, I'd have seen rusty drawing pins stuck in their rough flesh. But I passed by. I heard there was a young teacher in the school now, with an array of coloured pencils in his breast pocket.